Mr. Calhoun, that dock is in violation of Section 14 of our community standards, and if you don't remove it within 30 days, we will remove it for you. That was Sheila Brandt, president of the Harrowfield Lake Homeowners Association, standing at the end of my gravel drive in white linen pants that were already collecting mud at the cuffs. She had a clipboard and a badge on a lanyard, the kind you order from an office supply website. And she said this to me the way you might announce a parking ticket to someone who does not speak the language. What she did not know, and never bothered to find out, was that I am a licensed riparian engineer, that I had surveyed this property myself before closing, and that the shoreline access easement attached to my deed had been recorded with Morgan County in 1961, 26 years before the Harrowfield HOA held its first meeting or wrote a single word of its community standards. I want to ask you something before I tell you the rest. If a woman showed up at your property and told you that a dock your deed specifically protects was going to be torn down in 30 days, what would you do? Drop a comment. I kept my answer in a manila folder. My name is Ray Calhoun. I am 58 years old, and I spent 31 years as a licensed civil and riparian engineer, the last 12 of them running my own small consulting firm out of Jefferson City. I know how to read a plat map the way a mechanic reads an engine, not as a picture but as a record of decisions. Each line a commitment someone made and signed. There are engineers who treat property surveys like abstract geometry, all numbers and reference points. And there are engineers who understand that every line drawn on a plat represents something physical on the ground. A fence post, a creek bed, a corner pin buried 40 years ago that is still exactly where someone said it was. I am the second kind. When Donna and I decided to retire early to the Ozarks, I spent 4 months on due diligence before we signed a single paper. I pulled the full deed chain on the 11-acre parcel on the north shore of Pender Lake, going back to the original federal land patent from 1903. I read every transfer, every recorded exception, every appended instrument. The 1961 shoreline access easement was right there in the chain, recorded in Book 44, page 312 of Morgan County property records, attached to the parcel in perpetuity. The easement granted unobstructed access to the water's edge, the right to maintain a fixed dock structure not to exceed 48 inches in width, and it stated plainly that it could not be modified, restricted, or extinguished by any subsequent homeowner association whose governing documents post-dated the recording. I noted all of this. I put copies in a folder. Then I bought the land. Donna had grown up 2 parcels down from that north shore. Her grandfather had fished Pender Lake every summer morning for 30 years. Same spot, same hours, same kind of quiet. She had not been back to the lake in a decade when we drove out to look at the property. And when we walked out to the dock on that first visit, she stopped at the end of it and stood very still with the water just below her feet and the pine ridge on the far shore in full green. And she did not say anything for a long time. I did not either. The view from the back porch of that house was the most content I ever saw her. We moved in the spring of 2019. She passed in the fall of that year, a stroke, fast, with almost no warning, on a Tuesday morning when I was in the next room. I stayed. The lake was hers first, and I was not going to leave it. Macy, my daughter, was 13 at the time, and she was not going to leave it either. She had her mother's way of sitting very still on the dock in the early morning, watching the mist come off the water like she was listening for something. And I never once asked her what she heard. The Harrowfield HOA had been operating since 1987. By 2019, it covered 42 residential parcels around the lake's perimeter and collected dues from most of them. I paid mine the first year without any particular opinion about it. The HOA maintained the road in, kept the shared boat ramp clear, and handled the seasonal debris removal from the common area near the East Dock. It was a functional organization doing unremarkable work, and I had no quarrel with it. Sheila Brandt had been president for 8 years running, which I later learned was not because the community loved her, but because nobody else wanted the work. She drove a white SUV with a vanity plate I will not repeat here, and she ran the compliance walkthroughs herself with a clipboard and a camera, wearing the kind of blazer that belonged at a country club committee meeting and not on the gravel shore of a working Ozark lake. Her husband Dale ran Brandt Lakeside Development LLC out of a glass front office in Camdenton. I had seen his sign once near the county road on a development project 4 miles east and had not thought about it. I did not know what Dale wanted from this lake. I would find out, and the finding out would explain everything that came after. The first letter arrived in March of 2020. It was formal, typed on HOA letterhead, and it informed me that my dock structure did not meet Harrowfield's current dimensional standards, specifically that its width exceeded the permitted 36 inches by 4 inches on one side. I took my tape measure to the dock that afternoon. I measured the platform at 36 inches across at 5 separate points. I photographed each measurement with the tape still in frame. I wrote a polite response, included copies of the photographs, and filed a copy of the whole exchange. 4 weeks later, a second letter arrived, identical in substance but now citing Section 14, subsection C, which specified that any dock structure must have been approved by the board's architectural committee prior to construction. My dock had been built in 2003 by the prior owner. The HOA was founded in 1987. Its own covenant, the one I had read carefully before closing, covered new construction after the founding date. The prior owner's dock pre-existed the relevant subsection by 16 years. None of that history appeared to matter to Sheila Brandt. I wrote another polite response, attached a copy of the 1961 easement language, and filed a copy of that too. By autumn of 2020, I had 4 letters in the folder. None of them had cited the correct section twice. Each one introduced a new violation, a slightly different framing, a different subsection number. I started keeping a log on a legal pad, 1 line per letter, date received, section cited, whether the section had ever been cited before. It had a column for basis in recorded fact. That column stayed empty. The fine started in February of 2021. The first notice was for $150, citing an unapproved structure. The second, 6 weeks later, was for $250, citing continued non-compliance. Total fines assessed, $400. Total fines paid, 0. I sent written notice both times that the dock was protected by a recorded easement predating the HOA's founding documents, and that I was not acknowledging the fines as valid obligations. I filed copies of every response. Then, on a Thursday morning in April of 2021, a man I had never seen before appeared at the gate to my lake path. He was wearing a yellow safety vest and carrying a clipboard with a sheaf of papers that looked official from a distance. He introduced himself as a representative of the Ozarks Regional Property Standards Office. He said it pleasantly, the way you would say it if you had been saying it all week. He asked to inspect my dock. I set down the coffee I was carrying and looked at him for a moment. I asked to see his commission card. He said he had left it at the office. I told him calmly that without a commission card, I could not grant access to my path, and he was welcome to have his office call me directly, and we could schedule a time. He said there were complaints on file, and the inspection was time-sensitive. I said the number for my home office was on the mailbox, and I looked forward to their call. He stood there for a second, the clipboard held up just a little like a shield. And then he turned and walked back up to the road. I watched him get into a white utility truck with no agency markings at all, not a seal, not a web address, nothing, and pull out without a word. I went inside and spent 45 minutes calling every county and state agency I could locate that used the words property, standards, and regional in any combination. None of them had sent anyone to Pinder Lake that morning. None of them had a yellow vest inspection program for residential docks. There was no Ozarks Regional Property Standards Office. I wrote this down in the legal pad: date and time, inspector's approximate height and age, vehicle description, and a partial plate I had copied from memory at the gate. I flagged the note with a paper clip and put it in a separate section I labeled Third-Party Contact. Terrence Webb lived 3 parcels east of me. A retired county recorder who had spent 29 years managing land records in Morgan County before his retirement in 2015. He knew the deed chain on every parcel around that lake from memory, the way some men know baseball statistics. Not because it was his job anymore, but because that knowledge was a habit he had never seen reason to break. He had been watching the letters arrive, and my polite responses go out for the better part of a year. And one Thursday evening in May, he drove his truck around the lake road and knocked on my door with a 6-pack under one arm and a folded paper under the other. He set the 6-pack on the kitchen table. He said, "You know why she wants your dock gone?" I said I had a suspicion, but I wanted to hear his version. He unfolded the paper and laid it flat. It was a photocopy of Dale Brandt's preliminary development application to the Morgan County Planning Commission, filed the previous September. Dale was proposing a private marina and resort dock complex on the northern shoreline of Pinder Lake. Projected cost of $9 million, 72 boat slips, a restaurant and event pavilion. Private access for the resort's guests only. His preliminary site plan showed exclusive controlled water access at 4 specific points around the North Shore. A red line ran along each access corridor. One of those red lines ran directly across the location of my dock. The application noted in its access section that the developer would need clear title or full easement release from any competing access claims before the county would consider final approval. Terrence set his finger on that sentence without saying anything. I looked at it for a minute. Then I added the photocopy to the folder. I also made a second copy and put it in an accordion file I kept in the truck, because I had been in this profession long enough to know that single copies have a way of becoming unavailable at the wrong moment. Macy had turned 15 by then. She came home from school on a Wednesday afternoon in October to find a padlocked steel gate installed across the footpath from my back property line down to the lake. The path was inside my deed, not in dispute, not ambiguous, not within 50 feet of any adjacent parcel boundary. It ran from the back corner of the house straight to my own shoreline, entirely on land I owned, on ground I had surveyed myself. The lock was a heavy commercial hasp with a yellow warning tag reading Harrowfield HOA, access under review. Macy called me from her cell phone, and I could hear in her voice that she was keeping it very controlled. She said, "Dad, there's a gate with a lock on the path." I told her to take a photograph of the tag from 3 feet, front and both sides, and to go back inside and lock the house door. She did. I was back on the property in under 2 hours, having left a client meeting 40 minutes early. Deputy Harlan Cole out of the Morgan County Sheriff's Office came out the next morning. He was a steady man in his early 40s who had responded to my trespass complaint about the fake inspector the prior spring and who had since become someone I trusted to see a situation clearly. He looked at the gate, looked at my deed, and the survey plat I laid on my truck hood, and said he was not authorized to remove it on the spot, but that with the documentation I had, not showing the path was within my parcel boundary, I had clear grounds for a formal trespass complaint and we could pursue civil removal. He filed the report. I filed the formal complaint that afternoon with all photographs attached. The gate came down 11 days later after my attorney sent a 3-page letter citing unlawful conversion of private property and referencing the prior fake inspector complaint as part of a documented pattern. I noted the date the gate came down. I also noted that no one from the HOA acknowledged the removal or offered any explanation for the installation. That was the 5th documented incident. The binder was filling up. That winter, I started making calls to the other Shoreline property owners, specifically the ones Terrence had identified as having received written purchase offers from Brant Lakeside Development. Dale had been quiet about the acquisitions, framing the offers as community consolidation, pricing them below market in a way that felt reasonable to families who had owned the land for 30 years and were tired of paying taxes on it. 2 families on the South Shore had already sold. 3 more were weighing it. I asked each of them the same question. Did they know what Dale intended to build on the land he was assembling? None of them did. I showed them the planning application. I said nothing else and made no argument. I was polite, and I left when they asked me to. 2 of them called me back within a week to say they had declined Dale's most recent offer. The harassment of my clients began in the spring of 2022. I still ran consulting work from the home office, primarily property boundary analysis and watershed assessments for smaller county governments and private landowners throughout the region. 3 of my longtime clients, all of whom had retained me on ongoing contracts, received letters on Harrowfield HOA letterhead at their business mailing addresses. The letters claimed I was operating an unlicensed commercial enterprise from a residential parcel in violation of community use standards, and suggested that retaining my services might expose them to associated regulatory liability. The citation in the letters was for a covenant clause that addressed short-term rentals and transient lodging. It had no relation to professional consulting, and any competent reader would see that in 30 seconds. One of my clients was a woman who had spent 12 years as a county attorney before opening her own practice. She called me, and she was laughing before I finished saying hello. She said the citation was so misapplied, it was almost admirable. She also offered to sign an affidavit documenting the receipt and content of the letter if I ever had use for it. I thanked her and told her I would be in touch. That affidavit arrived in July and went into the binder, which by then had become a 2-inch labeled binder with tab dividers. 3 letters to clients, 3 clients retained, 6 affidavits in the correspondence section. The formal cease and desist from the HOA's retained attorney arrived in August of 2022. It was 12 pages, which I respected more than the prior letters, because at least someone had done research. The argument was easement abandonment. Missouri case law on easement abandonment requires clear and unequivocal intent to abandon a right, not temporary suspension of use. The attorney had cited a case from 1971 that involved voluntary written relinquishment, which is about as close to my situation as a lease dispute is to a land patent. And the brief skipped over a 2009 Missouri appellate ruling that had clarified the standard for riparian easements specifically. My attorney responded in 4 pages. Her response cited the 2009 ruling, attached the recorded easement instrument with the exact language about perpetuity, and noted that I had used the dock continuously since purchase and had filed documented maintenance records for it. The cease and desist was the 6th formal escalation. My attorney's response became Exhibit 11. I want to pause here and tell you that during all of this, I was doing something else quietly. Terrence was helping me track which Shoreline parcels remained in private hands and which had transferred to Dale's LLC. By late 2022, Dale had acquired 3 parcels on the south and east shore, about a third of the development footprint he needed. The longtime owners on the North Shore near me, a retired couple named Gil and Betty Watts, had been approached twice and were tired. Gil had farmed. He had worked 30 years in a lumber operation, and the idea of an HOA fight was not something he wanted at 71. I called him in October and asked if he would have dinner with me. He said yes. We sat at his kitchen table with Betty and a pot of coffee, and I showed him the planning application and the development renderings. I told him what his parcel represented to Dale's site plan. I told him I was willing to pay more than Dale's offer and that I intended to hold the land against the development. He looked at Betty. Betty said she had always thought the marina plan was going to ruin the fishing. Gil sold me the parcel the following month. 1.4 acres of shoreline directly adjacent to mine, deed recorded November 14th of 2022. I did not advertise the purchase. I filed the deed in the binder, noted the date, and drove home. Between December of 2022 and January of 2024, I purchased 5 more shoreline parcels. Each transaction was quiet, and each one came the same way. Through a conversation, not a letter, not an offer through an intermediary. I would drive to the owner's house or meet them at a diner, and I would show them the development application and the site plan. I told them what their land represented to Dale's Marina, what the resort would do to the lake access they currently enjoyed, and what I was willing to pay. I did not pressure anyone. Some of them said no, and I thanked them and left. Most of them said yes, eventually, because once they understood what was being assembled around them, and the question of who they sold to had a clear answer. The Brennan Strip on the East Shore came first, January of 2023, from a widow who had been living in Tulsa for 4 years and had been fielding lowball letters from Dale for 2 of them. The northeast quarter acre came in April from a family named Decker, who had owned it since 1978 and learned over breakfast that Dale's marina plan would put a boat launch 40 yards from where their grandchildren swam every summer. Rosa Hines called me herself in the fall, after Terrence had shown her the development renderings at her request, and said she would rather sell to me than watch a restaurant patio replace the view from her back window. The Klein half-acre, the last one before the hearing, closed December 19th. I drove home from the title company in the dark and sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes by myself. 7 parcels total, including the Watts. The whole northern shoreline and pieces of the east. I recorded each deed as it closed, filed a copy in the binder, and said nothing about it publicly. This is the part I want you to hold on to, because it is the part most people would have skipped. While I was responding to every fine notice and every letter and every lawsuit, I was also simultaneously buying the ground out from under the person who filed them. That is not aggression. That is preparation. Those are different things. The lawsuit arrived in January of 2023. Dale's LLC filed it, not the HOA, which told me the HOA's attorney had finally examined the 1961 easement language carefully enough to advise against filing in the HOA's name. The suit claimed easement abandonment, nuisance arising from my consulting activity, and a third count that was the most revealing of all: interference with prospective economic advantage. The interference claim argued that the mere existence of my recorded easement constituted an active interference with the developer's pending application because the county required resolution of competing claims as a condition of final approval. They were, in plain terms, suing me for owning a legal right and declining to give it away. My attorney filed a motion to dismiss all 3 counts within 30 days, with the 2009 appellate ruling attached to the first count. She also filed a counterclaim for abuse of process and malicious prosecution, and she attached every letter, every fine notice, every complaint report, every affidavit, every copy from the binder as exhibits. 19 exhibits in the initial filing. The counterclaim described a documented pattern of coordinated harassment beginning 3 years earlier. The motion to dismiss was pending when the real line got crossed. October of 2023. Macy was 17. She had taken to coming out to the dock on weekend mornings and sitting there with me the way she had since she was small. And sometimes we talked, and sometimes we just watched the water. She had her mother's patience on the water, the same quality of stillness. And I had come to rely on those mornings in a way I did not always name out loud. I think she understood by then what was at stake and why I had not moved and why I would not. That was not something we had discussed directly. It did not need to be. On the morning of October 14th, she walked down the path at 7 and came back to my office in less than 3 minutes. She did not knock. She opened the door and said quietly, "Dad, the dock posts are gone." I went down with her, and I saw it. 2 of the 4 fixed support posts had been cut below the water line. Clean angled cuts consistent with a reciprocating saw used from a boat or from the water itself. The dock platform was still floating, tied to the remaining 2 posts at a bad angle, listing into the shallows. I stood there for a moment. I told Macy we needed photographs from every angle before we touched anything. She was already taking them. 19 photographs in 4 minutes. Every cut face, every metal shaving still caught in the wet gravel, the tire tracks at the edge of the path where equipment had been brought down from the road. I called Harlan. He arrived at 2 in the afternoon, examined the cuts, and said it was criminal destruction of property, and he would be filing it as a felony. He asked about surveillance cameras. I had installed 2 cameras on the rear of the house in the spring of 2021, the week after the fake inspector, covering the path to the dock and the dock itself. Both cameras backed up continuously to a local drive in my office and to an encrypted off-site cloud account I had set up through a service a colleague had recommended. The footage showed 2 men arriving at 2:17 in the morning with a utility trailer. They had a portable generator and a saw. They were at the dock by 2:26 and back at the trailer by 2:59. They departed at 3:04. One of the men, the one who handled the equipment, was wearing a green work jacket with the Brant Lakeside Development name and logo printed on the back left shoulder. Harlan watched the footage twice straight through. Then he said he needed a copy in 2 formats. I gave him one from the local drive and one pulled from the cloud account. He filed the criminal complaint that evening. Dale's LLC fired both men the following morning, which my attorney noted was the kind of response a company makes when it knows the men were on the clock at the time of the act. A financial crimes investigator from the Missouri Attorney General's office, a careful man named Brian, who had been copied on several of my attorney's filings as a matter of courtesy, now called her directly. He was looking at the development application, the preliminary site plan, the email history of the lawsuit, and the new criminal complaint as a single picture. He said he was opening an inquiry into potential fraud on the planning application and related financial representations. I noted his name and contact in the binder. Mike Sarles had been on the Harrowfield HOA board for 3 years. He was a retired high school principal, late 50s, who had joined the board in good faith, believing the HOA was a community governance body with a legitimate role in protecting property values around the lake. He called me on a November afternoon and asked if we could meet. He came to the house and sat at the kitchen table with his hands folded and said he had something he needed me to have. He told me he had been watching the escalation for 2 years and had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the board's role in it. He said he was resigning from the board the following week and wanted to do it properly. He had printed a 68-page email chain between Sheila and Dale covering the period from January 2020 through the prior spring. The earliest email was from Dale to Sheila, dated January 9th, 2020, 6 weeks before the first compliance letter reached my door. Dale's email told Sheila to begin formal compliance pressure on my parcel, named the dock specifically as the point of leverage, and said that if they could get me to release the easement or agree to sell, the North Shore access corridor would be clear for the marina application and they could move to final submission. Sheila's reply said she understood. Mike set the printed chain on my table in an envelope. He said he was filing copies with the County Planning Commission and with Brian at the AG's office. I told him to do what he thought was right. He did both the following week. The email chain became Exhibit 19 in the counterclaim and was cited in Brian's investigative demand 4 months later. The Morgan County Planning Commission held its public session on February 6th of 2024, a Wednesday morning, to hear Dale Brandt's final development application for the Pender Lake Marina and Resort Complex. The commission chambers held maybe 60 people. Every seat was taken. Sheila and Dale sat at the applicant's table in the front of the room with their attorney, Dale, in a dark jacket, and Sheila in a red blazer, both of them with the kind of stillness that comes from believing a situation is already resolved in your favor. I sat in the third row with Terrence to my left, Macy to my right, and my attorney 1 seat over. Harlan was near the back in plain clothes. Brian from the AG's office stood along the wall by the door. Dale's attorney presented the application for 40 minutes. Renderings of the marina, floating color prints showing sailboats and a restaurant patio, traffic studies, a letter from the Regional Tourism Board projecting economic benefit, the argument that all North Shore access points were available for the development's exclusive use, and that the one remaining competing easement claim was expected to resolve through ongoing litigation. The commission chair, a woman named Doris, who had been running planning sessions in Morgan County for 11 years, asked whether all 9 shoreline parcels reflected in the development footprint were under the applicant's control or in the process of acquisition. The attorney said 4 were owned outright by the LLC and the remaining claims were being resolved. She asked which parcels the LLC did not control. The attorney gave 5 names, including mine. I stood up. I said I had some recorded instruments I wanted to enter for the record. Doris said go ahead. I walked to the front of the room with the binder and set it on the applicant's table. I opened it to the tabbed section in the rear. I laid out 7 recorded deeds in a row, each one a shoreline parcel I had purchased quietly in the prior 2 years. The Watts parcel, the Brennan Strip on the East Shore, purchased from a widow who had been sent 3 lowball letters. The Northeast quarter acre from a family who had owned it since 1978 and declined Dale's offer after I showed them the development renderings over coffee. Rosa Hines's small lot on the North Reach, which she had decided to sell to me instead of Dale, after she learned the marina plan would block her view of the inlet she had watched every morning for 19 years. The Klein half-acre, purchased in December, 6 weeks before this hearing. 2 others from owners I had met through Terrence. 7 deeds, all recorded, all in my name or in the Calhoun Family Land Trust. I had established the prior spring with Macy listed as beneficiary. 7 of the 9 shoreline parcels that Dale's development site plan required were now mine. My 1961 easement predating the HOA's own founding covered the 8th. Dale's LLC controlled 1. Doris looked at the deeds for a long time. The room was very quiet. She picked up 2 of them and looked at the recording dates and the boundary descriptions. She set them back in the row. She said the application could not be approved with 7 of 9 required access parcels under a third-party claim, and she was tabling it pending resolution of those interests and pending any determination from the Attorney General's inquiry she had been made aware of. She asked the planning staff to note the conflict of record and forward the complete file to the AG's office. Dale's attorney started to speak. Doris said she was moving to the next item on the agenda. Dale did not look at me when I walked back to my seat. Sheila looked at me once, just before she stood from the table. It was a brief look, and then she turned and walked toward the door. And that was the last time I saw her in her capacity as anything. The two men who had cut my dock posts entered guilty pleas in April of 2024. As part of the restitution order, Brant Lakeside Development, LLC, was named a responsible contributing party and required to fund full restoration of the dock structure at a total cost of $14,000. My attorney's counterclaim settled in June of the same year. The settlement covered 3 years of documented legal fees, full reimbursement for the economic disruption to my consulting practice across the harassment period, and a formal written release of all HOA claims against my parcel dating back to the first compliance letter in March of 2020. The release was unconditional and recorded with Morgan County. 0 fines were ever collected from me. 0. Dale's development application was formally withdrawn in May, after the AG's office issued a civil investigative demand targeting the email chain, the fraudulent access representations in the planning application, and the financial records of Brant Lakeside Development, LLC, going back to its first acquisition on the South Shore. The inquiry was ongoing at the time of this telling. 2 board members resigned from the Harrowfield HOA before the summer annual meeting, including Sheila, effective immediately following the commission hearing in February. The association voted at that meeting to amend its governing documents to explicitly exclude any provision that conflicted with a recorded pre-existing easement, and they contracted a licensed surveyor to walk and verify every parcel boundary in the community. I thought Donna would have found that funny. Specifically the surveyor part. I think she would have appreciated the precision of it. The dock restoration was finished on a Friday in late July. Macy had taken the day off from her summer job to be there when the crew left. After they pulled out, she walked down the path, and I followed her, and we sat on the rebuilt platform with the posts solid under us, and the same heron working the shallows it had worked that morning in October, picking its way through the reeds like it had never heard of any of this. She said, "It's exactly the same as before." I said that was the idea. She leaned back in the chair and looked at the far ridge and did not say anything else, and neither did I. Here is what I want you to take from all of this. Before you buy any property in a community with an HOA, pull the full deed chain back to the original land patent. Not the summary the HOA hands you at the closing table, the actual recorded chain, every transfer, every instrument attached to the parcel. If there is an easement recorded before the HOA's founding date, that easement is senior to every covenant and community standard the HOA has ever written. It cannot be restricted or extinguished by their documents, because their documents did not exist when it was recorded. Walk your own boundary against the plat. Not against the fence someone put up. Not against the line someone points to. Against the recorded plat and your survey pins. If you are receiving compliance pressure that feels coordinated, file a public records request on every development application filed in your surrounding area in the past 3 years. The motive is almost always in the land records, if you know where to look for it. Build the binder from the first letter. Log every contact, every date, every cited section. It costs almost nothing, and it compounds. The case that defeats them was often already won before they knew they had lost it. If any of this sounds familiar, drop your story in the comments. I read every one of them. If you found this useful, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Next time, a combat veteran who spent 2 years hand-cutting a road to his mountain cabin, and the county engineer who showed up one morning with a sign that said County Road 7 and a plan to bill him for using it.